When is the beginning of Shinto? In the 2nd and 1st century BC, across the Korean Strait, a cultural flood began to enter Japan. But it wasn't until the great Chinese influence on Japan did Japan say, hey, we should write some of this down, as their cultures began to mingle. The Kojiki of 712 and Nihon Shoki of 720, a collection of myths, traditions, ceremonies for a mostly oral tradition, written down at a time when the ancient myth was believed. Since then, Shinto hasn't stopped changing. Isn't this just simple history? Well, it's not that simple. Because Shinto has no scripture, no founder, no organization like the Catholic Church does. It doesn't even fully differentiate itself from some of its Chinese, Taoist, Buddhist influences that have changed the way Shinto is practiced today. Let's talk about Shinto today and unpack some of the findings that we've had in our very short time researching this subject coming up. Welcome to the CodeX Cantina, where I am Una.
And I am Kami Crypto.
So first, what is this video? If you're coming here, we usually just do book and literature reviews, and we typically do religious breakdowns and interpretations as a part of a lot of our selections. Japanese is something that's very near and dear to my heart. I've had a Japanese East Asian language studies minor in college, and it's something that we wanted to learn more and dive more into the Shinto aspect of things to really understand it, to help us and interpret it. Now, along came maybe Midrash, which kind of gave us the nudge that we needed, that where this is a month where the idea was to help understand and translate kind of what these religions mean to us, not with the intention of converting anyone, not with the intention of disproving the religion either. This is really just a discussion for us to better understand the religion and maybe what it means to us as people.
So we're not looking to question anybody's faith. We're just looking to get more intellectually inclined about a different type of belief system.
Okay, so we took this month to kind of work on various Shinto texts. We've got a couple of different of them, and I'll put the links to them in the description below. I had a very faith-based one, which is from Motohisa Yamakage, which is a very long-standing Shinto sect. I also have some books such as like this World Mythology book, which has to deal with like creation stories of a lot of different myths. We have a seminal work, and Crypto here read a Shinto work from a secular standpoint. So we've got a lot of different texts that we're going to be pulling from for this discussion.
So one thing I want to point out is that we are looking at this as outsiders. I don't practice Shinto faith, but I have studied many different religions. And in college, I had a minor in religion. So I studied Catholicism and Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Zoroastrianism. So I've studied many different religions, and this is one that I find fascinating.
All right, so if you guys will allow us to go through this discussion today with the idea of just kind of sharing where we are. Again, we're new in this process. If you're a heavy Shinto user, by no means are we trying to explain or educate people. We're just sharing our experience, what we've learned so far, and compare it maybe with a little bit of a Western view of how maybe we kind of are trying to make sense of this. So in terms of scope, we're going to go through what is religion, because I think it's important we kind of agree on what that is for today's discussion. What is Shinto? What is Shintoism?
What is Shinto not?
What is Shinto exactly? Some pluralistic facts about Shinto that I think are super interesting and very important. We're also going to go through kind of the creation myth story. We have some more stuff on like nature, Jinja, Harai, Shinkon, death, but I don't know if we're going to get to those. We may have to do a part 2.
Yeah, I think that our goal is to stay very, very basic, right? And then we can get into some more complex stuff as we learn more and get better at this.
So I think we should first define for ourselves what is religion and what do we, for the purpose of this talk, I should say, right? Because a lot of times in the West, we can think of religion in terms of its organization, in terms of like the Catholic Church, for example. We can think of communities too. Like, you know, some are all about the communities and the singular church community that they create around the worship. And then we also have religions with plurality here in the United States too, but I feel like a lot of people don't necessarily know about them. And in the same way that, you know, Christianity and Catholicism do exist in Japan, but it's a minority.
Right. A lot of times I ask my students, I say, well, what is religion? And one of the number one answers, always a hand will shoot up and they'll say, oh, it's church. And I said, oh, the building you go to? And they're like, well, sort of. It's the place we go to, but it's to worship a god. I'm like, oh, okay, interesting. And it's a very narrow view of maybe what most people would consider religion.
Sure. And I think for the purpose of our talk today, we want to be more inclusive of not necessarily applying our lens to it, but what are some different ways that people look at it. And one of the things that I wrote down here is that in some ways, religions are how different regions of human beings make sense of the world, right? We have creation stories. We have after we're dead, do we have a soul? What happens to our, is it just over? Is there something that we here need to do to help people go on to the afterlife? Is there an all-powerful being that just ushers a spirit away to the afterlife? There's a lot of different ways that we make sense of the value that we bring to the world, and religion sometimes helps create that structure, or at least provide some structure for people if they're looking for it.
Yeah, and one of the other things that my students will always say is, oh, well, it's the rule book for life. I get that answer a lot as well, and I don't think that's entirely true either because of how unique that I've learned Shinto is.
Oh yeah, for sure. Okay, so what is Shinto? And I've got a Shinto scholar, Hori Ichido, who defines Shinto and Shinto-ness as the underlying will of the Japanese culture. But I think what helps is defining what Shinto is not, or what Shinto doesn't have, to really set up, well, why is Shinto so different? So let's unpack some of this, because there's no founder to Shinto. There's no Jesus, as in Christianity, or Muhammad in Islam. Shinto is just of the people. And I think that's important to realize, that they don't view this as this was something that was given to us. This was created from us, which I think is kind of important.
I think it really also depends on maybe when you're looking at it. And I know we're going to have to talk a little bit about the history of it, because I think that Shinto could be an invention of tradition for the Japanese people. And as you move through time, it's going to evolve. And that is very different than a lot of the other religions that you might want to start comparing it to.
Then that brings us to our next point, that there's no doctrine or commandments. Dr. Gene Herbert has said, I met over 1,000 Shinto priests and Shintoists, and I have never heard the same words from each of them. In Shinto, people don't talk in the same pattern. They neither need nor are obligated to talk in the same fashion. And I think that's what's interesting. Like you talked about, Shinto is evolving, and I don't even know if anyone can really define what Shinto is. If you're out there watching, you're like, I know exactly what Shinto is. You need to go to Japan and explain it to all the scholars that are arguing and can't figure it out, because it's part cultural for Japan too. This isn't just religion. This is religion and culture. This is how they experience, view, and look at life.
Yeah, that's what my author said in my book as well, is that it has its own distinct flavor and it has a life of its own. And depending on which monk you talk to, or which Buddhist priest that is practicing Shinto, it's hard to separate all of those together because of its uniqueness in the regional areas and depending on what temple you're at as well.
The quote where he says they don't feel the need that they need to standardize it too. That's not part of the ideal of what they're looking for, as opposed to how we may be looking for how to define it from a Western standpoint.
Yeah, because you can't just find the answer in the text. You can't find the answer in its rituals. You can't find the answer in its sacred places like you can maybe in a lot of the other religions, finding it in the Torah or the Bible, or going to Mecca or going to Jerusalem. It doesn't have that like these other religions.
Now, in my notes, in terms of original texts, which aren't even original, it was written to document as outside resources came in to Japan in terms of 712 and 720. But the Nihon Shoki, allegedly, there's only 3 references to the word Shinto in that. And in the original mythology, the original documentation of our culture and our text, there's only 3 mentions of the word Shinto.
Yeah, and they're from the 8th century, I believe.
Yeah, 720. And I think that's interesting too, because you're like, okay, well, if without a doctrine, what brings people together, or how does this work or get passed down, even if there's nothing to study or really look at besides the Nihon Shoki, which is now many, many centuries old. And I think that's interesting when you start to think about the festivals, because when we think about events such as Lent or something like that, we think about procedures. And festivals are that for Japan too, but when you think about these procedures, it's conveying a lot of stuff in terms of nonverbal communications. It's about being in nature, being at the shrine, being with Shinto in the sense of revering the kami and trying to listen and show and offer respect to them. It's much different than what would be a written text, where if you go to maybe a Christian or Catholic church, you're going to hear very specific hymns, very specific words said, praise be to God, peace be with you. We like to say and all repeat similar things as a congregation or as a mass or gathering of people. That doesn't exist in Shinto. that is a very individualistic practice and way to express a connection with nature from a Shinto perspective.
But if you think about it, people are like, oh, this is written down, it can't change. Well, that's not true. People change the stories all the time to fit their needs. And as you have things translated from one language to another, it changes and the words change and the meanings of words change. Where something like Shinto doesn't heavily rely on things being written down, it's passed through oral tradition. And while, yes, there is a possibility for things to get changed that way as well, it's being hold solid for 700-800 years now, or no, longer than that, it'd be 1400 years now. That's pretty incredible in itself too, to not rely on something like the Bible or the Torah or the Quran.
Well, you bring me into another point. I'm going to skip ahead here. We're going to go into a section about there's no sin or guilt, and how in Shinto it's more about evil and your soul is perfect. It is of kami. But the acts that you do, if you create an evil act, that's on the act and not necessarily on your soul directly. We'll come back to that, I feel like. So you're bringing me to my point about language. Here's a question. How did your book define what Shinto meant, like the word Shinto?
Yeah, so it said that Shinto means the way of the kami.
And I think 9 out of 10 resources will say that. Interestingly enough, the seminal article about Shinto that I read, and I'll have the link in the description below, it talks about how in the 8th century, the do or the to in Shinto meant something very different than way of that it means today. Back then, it apparently meant right action or conduct, as in right action of kami or conduct of kami, rather than way of the kami. So even just through time, meanings of specific words in kanji change too, where should we really be talking about the way of the kami? Should we be talking about the right action or conduct of kami in a sense?
Yeah, I think there's numerous examples that we could go through to show the diversity of this, of how it's evolved over time.
All right, so first of all, we've said the word kami way too many times for not having defined it for the person for the person that knows nothing. We're kind of walking through this with you guys. Obviously, if you're way more advanced, this part's boring for you. What is a kami, Crypto?
I would say that it is. You could look at it either as a spirit or a deity, a demigod, maybe something in that realm or venue is kind of how it was portrayed in my book.
And we'll go through the creation story, which I think might help kind of confuse things further.
Yeah, but it's not necessarily. It's easier to say what it's not than what it is. It's not a god per se. An all-knowing, benevolent God, it is not. They
aren't necessarily all good, they aren't necessarily all evil, and they aren't immortal.
Yeah.
Right? So you might be comparing them to Greek gods or to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. They're not the same thing in the sense of how the Japanese look at them. And they can be anything, right? So a kami is a spirit, right? That is, I think, of heaven for the most part. The goal of Shinto is to become a kami yourself. The idea is your spirit, your internal essence could become a kami, right? Not too unlike, I guess, kind of some Buddhist thoughts and processes, but the idea is that you're training to become like that.
And probably the most famous one that you may come across in your studies is Tenjin. So, and I really kind of related to that one because he was a teacher and a scholar, and he becomes a kami of education for Japan and is probably the second most popular of all the kami in Japan today.
Yeah, and the maybe the most important being Amaterasu, but there are kamis for the mountains. There are kamis for maybe some specific rocks or specific trees, to the entire sky, to the ocean. There's literally kamis everywhere in Japan because it's the idea of the essence of this heavenly spirit coming down to earth.
Yeah, and each one can get it different. Like Mount Fuji gets its own specific kami, where a different mountain will have a different one for it, to represent it. And it is really this blending of, a lot of times, nature with these humanistic characteristics blended together with animism is what it is, I think. At least that's how I perceive it.
I had a quote from the Shintoist in my book. It said, in Shinto, heaven, earth, and humanity are different manifestations of one life energy.
Yeah, I think we were talking about that, and I said, basically this is the real version of the Force.
Right. So the idea is that when these kami come down from heaven, the heaven in Japan myth, lore, religion, whatever you want to call it, is that they come down and you can kind of feel their energy in specific spots, whether it be the mountain, whether it be the trees. If you're trained to receive the spiritual essence. In theory, the Shinto priests and such, there's a whole cast of names depending on your role in Shintoism, can feel it and can and even create shrines to allow these kami to come down, because the idea is the kami's bodies aren't coming down. Like, it's not like they actually imagine a god standing up in front of them. What they view is that they're spirits. So the kami spirit comes down and kind of imbues that area with its power. But the kami, since it's not them, it's their spirit coming down, you can kind of view it as how clean is the area. Cleanliness is huge when it comes to Shinto. And you can only kind of really experience this if the area is pure, if the area is clean. The dirtier it is, whether it be from evil or impurities that are causing harm or evil thoughts, the kami won't want to come down because they only like pure areas. And that's where you kind of get into the shrines and then the cleaning that we'll get into later. But that's the idea of this Japanese kami, the way of the kami or the content of kami, is that they come down to areas and you can imbue and worship them in specific spots, feel their energy as long as you're pure and of heart and mind and body.
Yeah, easy to say. It's purity versus impurity.
Right.
Is kind of how I think my guy presented it. So
we can't really avoid external influences. Along came Buddhism, and boy did it influence Shintoist practice, and some people would argue that 25% of Shinto is just Buddhism, to the point where the old habits of how they would perform burials or death services, Shinto doesn't even do it anymore. When Buddhism came along, they're like, you take it. Because the idea is that once a body is dead, the bad, evil energy, the kagare, that is something that they don't want to deal with, and Buddhism's like, hey, we can help with that. So all funeral services are mostly just Buddhist now, even.
My guy kind of presented it that a person that practices Shinto from the 10th century were to come today and see what Shinto is, they wouldn't recognize it because of the heavy influence of Buddhism and how it's transformed it and changed its traditions in so many of the festivals and the cultural and just how everything is usually performed.
And I think you used a very important word there. You said changed it. You didn't say replaced it or became it. Because the way that some of the articles that I read described it is they said that Japan has this very interesting view with Shintoism where it's pluralistic. They don't view that you have to be Shinto or you have to be Buddhist. You can be both. Because Shinto is so ingrained from a cultural perspective, when Buddhism came in, it wasn't just, hey, here's Buddhism, switch to this and go do that now. It was, oh, I think this is how we're supposed to do it, right? And the country of Japan applied a Japanese lens to that religion, like in terms of Zen Buddhism and such, that they practiced it in a way that it made sense to the Japanese as opposed to replacing the current Japanese way, if that makes sense.
So one way that I understood it from my author was that Shinto is amorphous and that it would be able to change and adapt these other things into it because it didn't view as itself as the perfect end-all be-all of religions, that it had room to evolve. And I thought that was pretty neat.
Well, it's interesting too. Zen Buddhism specifically, of a lot of the Buddhism sects, is the one that de-emphasizes sutra-based learning and instead emphasizes like mentor-based. Sounds an awful like a oral tradition way of passing down religion the way Shinto used to be. I don't know how that exactly came to be, but it's kind of odd the way that it kind of became its own thing under Shinto too, in a sense.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of that happened due to Japan being the first industrialized nation of Asia. And as they're going in and conquering China, they're taking back the traditions of Buddhism with them in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. And of course, there's going to be the influence of the Meiji Restoration. That's going to change it drastically as well. But there's a lot of history there of kind of how it evolves over about a 300-year period to incorporate so much Buddhism into Shintoism.
So I got a couple of stats here that I wanted to share just to kind of highlight this point. And the goal isn't take this and make it true, because I've noticed that the stats are wildly different based on who took it and that sort of thing. But this first one, what I want to show you is this religion breakdown, where you'll notice it says Shinto 51%, Buddhist 44%, other 5%. And you might walk away with the wrong idea that Shinto is the dominant religion. It's, followed by Buddhism. But you got to look at it from a pluralistic standpoint. I'm going to so this is taken a couple years later from a different company in terms of Encyclopedia Britannica. But you'll notice here, these numbers don't even line up to 100%. You'll notice it says 66% says Buddhism, and Shinto is 79%. But you'll notice that little special marker here where it says many Japanese practice both Shintoism and Buddhism. It is a pluralistic religion where it allows you to practice other religions in the context of it. It just so happens that Buddhism probably lines up a lot better than a single religion like Christianity, but there's actually this really weird phenomenon going through Japan right now where there's actually a lot of Christian weddings that happen from people that practice Shinto but still die and get buried in a Buddhist temple. It's a very interesting country that's going through this. I think
the cool thing about Shinto that I'm starting to realize is that it is one of the most open-minded of all the religions. It's not, this is the way and that is it. It's like, I kind of like that over there. We're going to take that. Oh, I like that over there. We're going to take that too. And I think that's really, really cool. And that's something that I've had to kind of struggle with because of, learn what I've learned in religions is that this religion thinks they're right, this religion thinks they're right, and this religion thinks they're right. And Shinto doesn't think that. And that is very, very unique.
Well, it's also in the tenets from what my guy kind of wrote about. He said that Shinto is more individualistic than community-based. It's about how do I relate to a kami? How do I show respect to this kami? And how do I train my own soul to eventually become kami itself? It's a self-discipline more so than a communal discipline put on them. And I think what's interesting too is I read some interviews in a separate research article, but it asked them to define kami and basically the Buddhas in terms of those that practice both. And you had answers where some people said that kami are another form of the Buddha. You have some that say the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas just manifest themselves as kami out of compassion to make sense to local Japanese individuals. And there's some that say that the kami are the spirits of the Buddha. So you've got them recognizing sometimes that they're two totally different systems. You've got some saying it's just one word, two different words to describe the same thing, in which case it's a translation thing. But you don't even have agreement within Japan of what all of these means to the earlier Shinto comments of, we don't all agree on how this is, but that's okay, because it's an individual-based process more so than a communal process.
Yeah. My guy said a little bit about the community stuff, but he did focus a little bit more that it is sometimes regional and that some of the regions hold to the traditionalism a little bit stronger than other areas. Like the bowing, for example, is heavy in certain areas of Japan, but not so much in things. But it's back to that it's changed over the centuries. And some areas will reinforce the traditions and some places will not. So again, it comes down to maybe sometimes more of a family than an individual is kind of what my guy was pushing. But I can see it on the same venue as what your readings were saying.
Yeah, no, I probably might have worded it too strong because there are specific shrine-based Shinto practices. There are specific regional practices, like you've said. It's really hard to define, even for people of Shinto and people who are of Shinto and Buddhism practices have a hard time defining it. How on earth do I, as a Westerner who doesn't practice it, have a hope at trying to define this for anyone? It's something that I feel like we're trying to feel our way through.
Yeah, I just think it's because it's so unique and different than what we were probably traditionally brought up on. And that's kind of cool, I think, that we're learning something so vastly different. At least I'm excited to learn it. I've had more fun with this book than I think I have in several months. I know I should admit that, but I really do. And that's the nerdy historian in me.
So let's go through the creation story real quick, because I did a little bit of research on this, and particularly since I have a book specifically on it. So this is written both in the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, which were the two original texts that I talked about that tried to document the mythology and such.
Okay.
And it seems that many texts, did yours book talk about this at all?
Yep, they talked about the two original gods.
Hang on. Let me guess. Yours started with Izanagi and Izanami.
Izanagi and Izanami.
Yep, we're gonna have to back up. Okay, and most books start with that, and that's not actually the original myth where we start.
Oh, cool. So I'm learning something new tonight here, channel.
We're going to start with the universe being this matter of shapeless matter / chaos, if you will, depending on your translation. And basically what happened was light rose up to kind of create the heavens, while the other heavier material kind of fell down, and that's what created the earth, the universe, if you will.
Okay.
So in this new heaven, 3 gods were just made. Boom. Okay? And eventually they became the 5 primordial deities as 2 more were created. So we have 5 gods, and the Shinto book that I have that's very faith-based, it does have like an explanation for why 3 and then 5. and why creation versus destruction. I won't go into that. I'll put the book in the description below if you want to go into that. But there's explanations for some of that. But what's interesting is after this, there's no mention in the rest of the Kojiki or the Nihon Shoki about these gods. Like, they just kind of become reclusive. And what happens next is the next generation, the 7 generations of deities, the Kamiyo Nananyo. That's hard to pronounce.
Yeah, it is. Good job.
Well, I don't think I did that right. So 2 more gods just kind of appear, but they're sexless and partnerless, just like the original 5 gods in the beginning of the creation of heaven. And what's interesting now is the next gods that are created, the next 8, is the first group of 4 all have genders, male and female, and then the last 2 are the Izanagi and Izanami. And they are the 2 that then reach with a spear into this mush of earth from heaven and lift up and create the islands of Japan, basically, from that spear. They start spitting out gods left and right, and those 2, brother and sister, marry and start to have kids, basically.
Oh, yeah. I thought it was hilarious because my guy called it primordial ooze. Said Izanagi shoved his staff down into the primordial ooze, and out of Izanami came Japan. And I was like, whoa, this is really interesting way to talk about sex. Well, where we just did that tag, this actually did it in a pretty creative way, I thought. My author was very, very creative.
So I've now read this story in 3 different books, The Creation of Japan, and all 3 of them use primordial ooze from the ones that I read too. Well, here's what's interesting too. So these 2, they walk around the island of Japan, and they're going to meet when they come back. But when they come back, Izanami, the female, speaks first to the man. The next kid that they have was the fire god, and Izanami was badly injured from it and actually died from it.
Yeah.
And they find out.
That was in my book.
And that's part of like this whole men are supposed to speak first, a cultural thing in Japan allegedly came from this story, this cultural myth of her speaking first, and that's what caused the abnormal child.
Yeah, mine talked about how that this was used sometimes to promote the men being the head of the household because he can't live without her, and he follows her into the underworld, and he sees her there, and she's all grotesque and nasty and like has maggots and stuff, and that she's trying to lure him in, and he has to end the relationship with her. And so this is, my author says that this is kind of how Japan comes with the tradition of that men are the head of the household.
Yeah, so it's interesting because she felt a lot of shame, and this is true to Japanese culture from what I've seen. She felt shame for having been seen like that, covered in the maggots in the land of the dead, and chased him away, right? And he sealed the land from the dead from that point. And, they're screaming at each other from the land of the dead past this boulder that he sealed it with to her. And she's like, I'm going to kill 1,000 people a day. He says, if you do that, I'm going to create 1,500. And that's actually very core to Shinto, being more about being a life-giving spirit, if you will, than death. And you'll notice that's how quickly they get rid of impurities, how quickly they get rid of the death funerals. They're very into being pure and good intention and good of heart is at the core. And this story speaks to that too.
Yeah, it seemed like it was more, it's sad, but it is a more uplifting story. And it kind of gives to that Shinto belief of positivity. Is how I feel like it was presented.
Yeah, no, I agree. And from this running away and how he got away by throwing and shedding clothes and then cleansing himself in the water, that goes more into kind of like the cleansing and all the gods that they created in terms of how you're supposed to meet them and represent them. We'll go more into that in the building and cleansing section. And we still have to talk a lot about even in terms of nature. We haven't talked much about nature. I think we'll create a part 2. We'll see. If not, thank you for checking out today. This has been a long enough video at this point in time. We'll try to create a part 2, but there's just so much more to talk about. And if there's one thing I wanted to wrap up, I hope we don't present anything of like we're trying to teach or talk down or anything like that. We're literally just sharing some of the research that we found in this. We're very new to the religion and are excited to kind of talk about this and use this in analysis when we talk about books that have, Japanese culture at the core of it and how we can see some of these values come out.
I would definitely consider myself a novice, super duper novice at this. I had a brief introduction in college 20 years ago from a Catholic priest. So I definitely consider myself a learner on this. And I know we're going to do a part 2 because I want to learn more about this because of how fascinating it is. I hope this doesn't come across as us being insensitive. We are just learning along with you guys on this, and that we don't have all the information.
If you guys would like to check out part 2, which we'll see if we can record here sometime soon, please consider subscribing, and we'll make sure to get that out along with other religious and literary breakdowns, which is what we usually do here. We are kind of branching out, so let us know if you guys got anything from this. Did you think it was interesting? What would you want to see more or less of? We're open to thoughts and suggestions.
Peace.